The crisp October morning air carried the scent of pine and promise as Sarah Patterson gripped the steering wheel of her aging Honda Civic, watching Lincoln Valley High School emerge from the Colorado mountain mist like something out of a postcard. But beneath the picturesque facade of brick buildings and towering evergreens lay a reputation that made even seasoned educators think twice. This was where teaching careers came to die, where idealistic young instructors crashed against the rocks of teenage rebellion and administrative indifference. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah killed the engine and sat for a moment, studying the imposing structure that would either make or break her future. At 26, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had already faced down more challenging opponents than most people encountered in a lifetime. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes held a determination that had been forged in wrestling rings across 3 states. She wore a simple navy blazer over dark jeans, professional but not intimidating, approachable but not weak. The teaching position at Lincoln Valley had opened suddenly when the previous English instructor suffered what the principal delicately called a complete nervous breakdown after only 6 weeks into the semester. The job posting had been buried deep in education websites, the kind of desperate listing that most qualified candidates scrolled past without a second thought. But Sarah wasn't most candidates, and desperation had a way of creating opportunities for those brave enough to seize them. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Denver, Sarah had learned early that respect wasn't freely given. It was earned through grit, determination, and the willingness to stand your ground when the world tried to knock you down. Her mother, a single parent who worked double shifts at a local diner, had instilled in her daughter the belief that education was the great equalizer, the one thing that couldn't be taken away once you had it. Sarah's path to teaching had been anything but conventional. While her classmates at Metro State University were studying abroad or interning at prestigious companies, she was spending her evenings and weekends on wrestling mats, channeling her frustrations and ambitions into a sport that demanded both physical and mental toughness. Wrestling had taught her patience, strategy, and the art of reading an opponent's weaknesses, skills that would prove invaluable in the classroom battlefield she was about to enter. By her senior year, Sarah had earned a full scholarship and captured 2 state championships, earning the nickname the Hurricane for her lightning-fast takedowns and relentless pressure. But a career-ending shoulder injury during her final match had forced her to reassess her future. Instead of wallowing in what might have been, she threw herself into her education coursework with the same intensity she'd once reserved for wrestling. Graduating summa cum laude with a degree in English literature and secondary education. Her student teaching experience at suburban Jefferson High had been a revelation. Sarah discovered she had a natural gift for connecting with teenagers, particularly the ones other teachers had written off as lost causes. She could see through their defensive armor to the scared, confused kids underneath, and she knew how to reach them because she'd once been one of them herself. But Jefferson High had been a sanctuary compared to Lincoln Valley. As Sarah walked through the main entrance, she was immediately struck by the undercurrent of tension that seemed to permeate the hallways. Students moved in tight clusters, their eyes constantly scanning for threats or opportunities. The walls were covered with motivational posters that someone had clearly hung in a desperate attempt to mask the underlying dysfunction. But the effort only made the problems more apparent. Principal Janet Morrison was a thin, harried-looking woman in her 50s who seemed to view each new teacher as another potential casualty in her ongoing war of attrition. She met Sarah in the main office with a handshake that felt more like a warning than a welcome. "Miss Patterson," she said, consulting a thick folder that Sarah assumed contained her predecessor's inevitable resignation letter. "I'll be honest with you. Room 314 is challenging. The students have been through 3 different instructors this semester alone. They've learned that if they create enough chaos, adults tend to disappear. Sarah nodded, feeling a familiar flutter of nerves mixed with anticipation. What happened to Mr. Hendricks? Principal Morrison's laugh was hollow. Let's just say he decided that managing a small bookstore in Aspen was more appealing than managing 17-year-olds with authority issues. The position is yours if you want it, but I won't sugarcoat the situation. These kids will test every boundary you set, question every decision you make, and push you to your absolute limit. Most people don't last a month. The warning might have intimidated a different person, but Sarah had spent years facing opponents who outweighed her by 40 pounds and have every intention of planting her face into the mat. A group of unruly teenagers, no matter how challenging, felt manageable by comparison. I'll take it, Sarah said without hesitation. Principal Morrison studied her with a mixture of admiration and concern. You have wrestling experience, I see from your resume. That might actually be an advantage here. These kids respect strength, but they have to believe it's real. The moment they sense weakness, they'll go for the kill. Room 314 was located on the 3rd floor, at the end of a hallway that seemed to stretch forever. Sarah's footsteps echoed against the worn linoleum as she made her way to what would either become her classroom or her battlefield. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear voices inside, not the excited chatter of students eager to learn, but the low, predatory murmur of a pack sizing up new prey. Sarah paused outside the door, taking a deep breath and centering herself. The way she used to before big matches. She thought about her mother, still working those double shifts, still believing that her daughter could change the world one student at a time. She thought about Coach Martinez, who had taught her that the most dangerous opponents were the ones who underestimated your resolve. And she thought about all the kids like her younger self, trapped in cycles of poverty and low expectations, waiting for someone to show them that there was another way. When Sarah finally pushed open the door to room 314, she was greeted by a scene that would have sent most new teachers running for the exit. Desks were arranged in seemingly random clusters, paper airplanes littered the floor, and the chatter died to an ominous silence as 30 pairs of eyes fixed on her, with the intensity of predators evaluating potential prey. In the back corner, 3 boys sat with the casual arrogance of young kings surveying their domain. The tallest one, with sandy brown hair and a varsity jacket that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, leaned back in his chair with a smirk that suggested he'd already decided how this encounter would end. His 2 companions flanked him like loyal courtiers, their postures radiating the kind of confidence that came from never facing real consequences for their actions. Sarah set her leather messenger bag on the desk and surveyed the room with the same methodical assessment she'd once used to study wrestling opponents. She could see the established hierarchies, the social dynamics, the unspoken rules that governed this particular ecosystem. Most importantly, she could see the challenge. In those back corner eyes, the assumption that she would be just another adult to manipulate and ultimately defeat. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "I'm Miss Patterson, and I'll be your English teacher for the remainder of the semester." The sandy-haired boy in the back raised his hand with exaggerated politeness. "Excuse me, Miss Patterson, but how long do you think you'll actually last here? Because we've had 3 teachers already, and they all said the same thing when they started." A ripple of laughter spread through the room, but Sarah noticed that not all the students were laughing. Some looked embarrassed by their classmates' rudeness, while others watched with the fascination of spectators at a gladiatorial combat. Sarah smiled, and for just a moment, something predatory flickered in her green eyes. "That's an interesting question, Mr. Mitchell." "Brandon Mitchell." "Well, Mr. Mitchell, I suppose we'll find out together, won't we?" The first week at Lincoln Valley High unfolded like a chess match between equally determined opponents. Sarah had survived the initial introduction, but she quickly learned that Brandon Mitchell's opening gambit was just the beginning of a much more complex game. Each day brought new challenges, subtle provocations designed to test her limits and expose any weakness in her armor. Brandon had assembled his crew with the precision of a military strategist. Derek Chun, the compact boy with designer sneakers and a smartphone that never left his hand, specialized in digital warfare, recording embarrassing moments, spreading rumors through social media, and coordinating group disruptions with military precision. Austin Rodriguez, the silent giant whose presence alone could intimidate most adults, served as the physical enforcer, his mere proximity enough to make other students think twice about challenging the established order. Together, they had perfected the art of classroom terrorism. Not the obvious punishable kind that would bring down administrative wrath, but the subtle, persistent harassment that slowly eroded a teacher's confidence and sanity. They knew exactly how far they could push before crossing lines that would trigger serious consequences, and they exploited those boundaries with surgical precision. Sarah's first mistake was underestimating their sophistication. She'd dealt with troublemakers before, but Brandon and his crew operated on a different level entirely. They studied her patterns, identified her pressure points, and began their assault with the patience of seasoned predators. It started with small things. Her carefully prepared handouts would mysteriously disappear from her desk between classes, forcing her to scramble to the copy machine during precious preparation time. Her whiteboard markers would run dry at crucial moments, leaving her stranded mid-lesson with 30 impatient faces staring back at her. Her classroom door would somehow lock itself from the inside, trapping her in the hallway while her students created chaos unsupervised. Each incident was individually explainable, easily dismissed as coincidence or minor inconvenience. But the cumulative effect was exhausting, a constant state of hypervigilance that left Sarah drained and second-guessing every decision. She began arriving earlier and staying later, trying to anticipate and prevent the next disruption. But Brandon's crew always seemed to be one step ahead. The laptop represented Sarah's lifeline to modern teaching. She'd invested her entire signing bonus in the top-of-the-line MacBook Pro, loading it with interactive presentations, video content, and digital resources that could transform dry literature into living, breathing narratives. It was her secret weapon, her way of connecting with students who had grown up in the digital age and lost patience with traditional textbook-based instruction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. On Wednesday morning of her second week, Sarah arrived early to set up for her most ambitious lesson yet, a multimedia exploration of power dynamics in Shakespeare's Macbeth. She'd spent the weekend creating a presentation that combined film clips, music, and interactive elements designed to make the centuries-old play relevant to modern teenagers. The laptop sat on her desk like a silver talisman, its screen displaying her carefully crafted slides. The first 3 periods went smoothly. Her freshman classes responded enthusiastically to the new approach, and even some of the more skeptical students began engaging with the material. Sarah felt a surge of confidence as she prepared for 4th period, AP English, Brandon's class, the ultimate test of her teaching skills. The students filed in with their usual mix of boredom and hostility, but Sarah noticed something different in their energy. There was an anticipation in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen. Brandon took his usual seat in the back corner, but instead of his typical slouch, he sat forward with predatory alertness. Derek positioned himself near the front, his phone conspicuously absent for once, while Austin moved to a desk that provided a clear view of Sarah's workspace. Sarah began her lesson with enthusiasm, launching into her presentation with the confidence of someone who had prepared extensively. The slides flowed seamlessly, her voice carried clearly through the room, and for a moment, She felt like she was finally connecting with these challenging students. Even Brandon seemed to be paying attention, his blue eyes fixed on her with unusual intensity. Midway through her analysis of Lady Macbeth's manipulation tactics, Sarah noticed Derek raising his hand. This was unusual. Derek rarely participated in class discussions, preferring to remain on the sidelines while Brandon took center stage. She paused her presentation, hopeful that she was finally breaking through his defenses. "Yes, Derek?" "Miss Patterson," he said with elaborate politeness, "I think you might want to check your laptop. Something looks wrong with the screen." Sarah turned to look at her computer, and her heart stopped. The screen was flickering erratically, lines of distorted text scrolling across what should have been her carefully prepared slides. But more alarming was the pool of water spreading across her desk, seeping under the laptop's base and dripping onto the floor below. "Oh no," Austin said with theatrical concern, holding up an empty water bottle. "I think I accidentally knocked this over when I was reaching for my textbook. I'm so sorry, Miss Patterson." The classroom erupted in barely contained laughter. Sarah could see the calculation in their eyes, the satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. Her laptop, worth more than some of these students' cars, was almost certainly ruined. But more than that, it was a direct assault on her ability to teach, her connection to her students, her very identity as an educator. Water continued to drip from the laptop's edges as Sarah carefully lifted it, trying to minimize the damage. The screen had gone completely black, and she could feel the weight of liquid sloshing around inside the case. 3 years of lesson plans, student assessments, and carefully crafted presentations, all of it potentially lost in an instant. The silence in the classroom was deafening. 30 pairs of eyes watched her reaction, waiting to see if she would break down, if she would finally reveal the weakness they'd been probing for. Sarah could feel the weight of their expectations, the assumption that this would be the moment. She cracked under pressure, but as she stood there, holding her ruined laptop, something unexpected happened. Instead of the devastation she should have felt, Sarah experienced a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't really about the laptop at all. It was about power, about control, about the fundamental question of who would determine the atmosphere and direction of this classroom. "Class dismissed," she said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that made several students look up in surprise. "Everyone except Brandon, Derek, and Austin. You 3 stay behind." The other students filed out in hushed whispers, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Sarah could see the mixture of fear and excitement in their faces as they reluctantly left the room, already composing the text messages and social media posts that would spread the news of this confrontation throughout the school. When the room was empty except for the 4 of them, Sarah carefully placed her laptop on a stack of papers, away from the spreading water. She turned to face the 3 boys, who were trying to maintain their casual arrogance despite the obvious shift in the room's energy. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone that made Austin shift uncomfortably in his seat. "I believe we need to have a conversation about respect." Brandon leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning as he sensed what he perceived as a weakened opponent. "Look, Teach, accidents happen. We said we were sorry. What more do you want?" Sarah studied him for a long moment, and for the first time since entering Lincoln Valley High, she allowed her old wrestling instincts to surface. She'd spent years reading opponents, identifying their weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The boy sitting before her was strong, confident, and completely unprepared for what was coming. "What I want," Sarah said slowly, "is for you to understand that actions have consequences. All of them, even the ones you think you can get away with." The threat hung in the air like a challenge, and Brandon's eyes narrowed as he tried to process this unexpected response. He'd been expecting tears, anger, or resignation, the typical reactions of defeated teachers. Instead, he was facing something he'd never encountered before, an adult who wasn't afraid of him. "Is that a threat, Miss Patterson?" Derek asked, his voice carrying less confidence than usual. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since the laptop incident, it was genuine. "It's a promise, Mr. Chun, and I always keep my promises." The aftermath of the laptop incident rippled through Lincoln Valley High like wildfire. By lunch, every student in the building had heard some version of the story, each retelling more dramatic than the last. Sarah could feel the weight of their stares as she walked through the hallways, and could hear the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she passed. She had become the subject of teenage folklore, the new teacher who had somehow stood up to Brandon Mitchell's crew without backing down. In the faculty lounge, the response was mixed. Some teachers offered sympathetic nods and knowing looks. They'd all been through similar trials during their tenure at Lincoln Valley. Others kept their distance, as if associating with her might somehow make them targets as well. The unspoken rule at the school was simple: survive by staying invisible. Don't make waves that might splash back on you. Mrs. Catherine Brennan, a veteran math teacher with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen every trick in the book, approached Sarah during her lunch break. She was one of the few faculty members who commanded genuine respect from both students and administration, having somehow managed to maintain order in her classroom while others fell by the wayside. "You've got their attention now," Mrs. Brennan said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Sarah with the careful movements of someone who had spent decades navigating hostile teenage territory. "The question is, what are you planning to do with it?" Sarah looked up from her sandwich, grateful for any conversation that didn't involve pitying glances or unsolicited advice about finding a different career. "I'm not sure I follow." "Brandon Mitchell," Mrs. Brennan said simply. "That boy has been running roughshod over this school since his freshman year. His father sits on the school board. His mother chairs the PT, a fundraising committee, and his grandfather practically built this town. He's untouchable through conventional channels." The weight of that revelation settled over Sarah like a cold mountain fog. She'd suspected that Brandon's confidence came from more than just teenage bravado, but the extent of his family's influence was sobering. No wonder previous teachers had simply given up and left. They weren't just fighting a difficult student, they were taking on an entire power structure. "So what do you suggest?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Mrs. Brennan's smile was sharp as a blade. "You find an unconventional channel. That boy respects exactly one thing in this world: strength. Real strength, not the paper-thin authority that comes with a teaching certificate. He needs to understand that there are still adults in this world who won't be intimidated by his family name or his father's money." The conversation stayed with Sarah through the rest of the day. During her afternoon classes, she found herself studying her students with new eyes, seeing the complex web of social dynamics that governed their interactions. Brandon's influence extended far beyond his immediate circle. Other students deferred to him, sought his approval, and modified their behavior based on his moods and whims. He wasn't just a disruptive student. He was the unofficial ruler of an entire teenage kingdom. That evening, Sarah drove to the small apartment complex where she'd rented a one-bedroom unit overlooking the valley. The damaged laptop sat on her kitchen table like evidence of a crime, its once pristine surface now warped and stained. She'd tried the usual remedies: rice, hair dryers, desperate online tutorials, but the machine was beyond salvation. 3 years of carefully crafted lesson plans, student assessments, and digital resources had vanished in an instant. As she sat in the growing darkness, Sarah found herself thinking about her wrestling days at Metro State. She remembered the moment she realized that some opponents couldn't be beaten through conventional tactics. They were too strong, too experienced, too confident in their superiority. Those were the matches where she'd had to dig deeper, find reservoirs of determination and creativity that she didn't know she possessed. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "How's the new job going, sweetheart? Dad would be so proud of you for following your dreams." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment. Her father had died when she was 12, but she still remembered his voice, his unwavering belief that every problem had a solution if you were willing to work hard enough to find it. He'd taught her to fix her own bicycle, to change the oil in her car, to stand up for herself when the world tried to push her around. Most importantly, he'd taught her that respect wasn't something you could demand, it was something you earned through your actions. The next morning, Sarah arrived at school with a new sense of purpose. She'd spent most of the night developing what she privately called the plan, a strategy that would either establish her authority once and for all, or end her teaching career before it truly began. It was risky, potentially career-ending, but Sarah had learned that sometimes the biggest risks yielded the most significant rewards. Fourth period AP English arrived with its usual mix of tension and anticipation. Brandon and his crew took their customary positions, clearly expecting another day of psychological warfare. They'd tasted blood with the laptop incident, and Sarah could see the hunger in their eyes as they waited for their next opportunity to strike. Sarah began the class with unusual intensity, pacing the room like a caged predator as she discussed the themes of power and manipulation in Macbeth. She could feel the shift in energy, the way even the most disengaged students leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something fundamental had changed in their teacher's demeanor. When she reached the climactic scene, where Macbeth faces his final challenger, Sarah stopped directly in front of Brandon's desk. The timing was perfect, the symbolism unmistakable. The rest of the class faded into background noise as she fixed him with a stare that carried the weight of years spent facing down opponents who thought they could intimidate her through sheer force of personality. "Sometimes," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence, "the only way to deal with a bully is to show them that you're not afraid to fight back." Brandon's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered his composure. "Is that right, Teach? And what exactly are you planning to fight back with? Another laptop?" The laughter that followed was nervous, uncertain. The other students could sense the undercurrent of real tension in the room, the feeling that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Sarah leaned forward, placing her hands on Brandon's desk with deliberate slowness. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of absolute conviction. "You think you're tough, Brandon? You think destroying my laptop makes you some kind of king?" She paused, letting the challenge hang in the air. "Prove it. Tomorrow after school, the old wrestling room in the basement. Just you and me, no phones, no witnesses, no daddy's lawyers. You win. You can run this classroom however you want for the rest of the semester. I win. You sit down, shut up, and maybe, just maybe, you might actually learn something." The classroom erupted in whispered exclamations and shocked gasps. Derek's mouth fell open. Austin shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and even the students, who usually stayed out of conflicts, leaned forward with fascination. But Brandon's reaction was the most telling of all. For just a moment, genuine surprise flickered across his features before being quickly masked by his usual arrogance. "You're challenging me to a fight?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Lady, you could lose your job for this. Hell, you could get arrested." Sarah straightened up, her green eyes never leaving his face. "I'm not challenging you to a fight, Mr. Mitchell. I'm offering you an opportunity to prove that all your tough talk isn't just empty posturing. Unless, of course, you're not as confident as you pretend to be." The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but no one moved. The tension in the room was electric, 30 teenagers witnessing what felt like a moment of historical significance. Sarah gathered her materials with casual efficiency, as if she'd just assigned a routine homework, reading instead of throwing down the most audacious challenge in Lincoln Valley High School. History. As the students finally began to file out in stunned silence, Brandon remained seated, his eyes fixed on Sarah with a mixture of respect and calculation. She'd done something no adult had ever done before. She'd called his bluff in front of his peers, challenged him on his own terms, and somehow made him look like the one who was backing down. "Tomorrow," Sarah said as she reached the door. 4 o'clock, don't keep me waiting. The hallway outside was already buzzing with excitement as news of the challenge spread like wildfire through the student body. Sarah could hear fragments of conversation, speculation about what would happen, bets being placed on the outcome. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, committed herself to a course of action that would either establish her as a force to be reckoned with or end her career in spectacular fashion. But as she walked toward the faculty lounge, Sarah felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the same rush she'd experienced before her biggest wrestling matches. For the first time since arriving at Lincoln Valley High, she felt like herself again, not just a teacher trying to survive, but a competitor preparing for the fight of her life. By 3:30 the following afternoon, Lincoln Valley High School had transformed into a powder keg of anticipation. Word of the challenge had spread far beyond the walls of room 314, creating an underground network of whispered conversations and clandestine text messages that reached every corner of the building. Students who had never spoken to each other were suddenly united by their shared fascination with what promised to be the most legendary confrontation in school history. The old wrestling room in the basement had been abandoned for 2 years. Ever since budget cuts eliminated the program and Coach Williams retired to his fishing cabin in the mountains, the space remained frozen in time-faded championship banners hung from the ceiling. Wrestling mats lay stacked in dusty corners, and the air still carried the phantom scent of exertion and ambition. It was the perfect arena for what was about to unfold. Sarah arrived early, needing time to prepare both physically and mentally for what lay ahead. She'd spent the previous evening going through her old wrestling gear, finding items she hadn't touched since her competitive days at Metro State. The black athletic pants and fitted tank top felt foreign after months of professional blazers and dress shoes, but they also felt like armor, a reminder of who she'd been before she became just another struggling teacher. As she stretched on the worn mats, memories flooded back with startling clarity. She remembered her first wrestling practice at 17, the way the older girls had looked at her with skepticism until she proved she belonged on their level. She remembered the state championship match where she'd faced an opponent everyone said was unbeatable, the moment when pure determination overcame superior technique. Most importantly, she remembered the lesson Coach Martinez had drilled into her. Wrestling wasn't just about physical strength. It was about mental warfare, about making your opponent doubt themselves before the match even began. The basement door creaked open at exactly 4 o'clock, and Brandon descended the stairs with the swagger of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. He'd changed into gym shorts and a Lincoln Valley football t-shirt, his sandy hair still perfectly styled despite the circumstances. Derek and Austin flanked him like bodyguards, their phones already out and recording, despite Sarah's explicit instructions about no witnesses. Behind them came a steady stream of students, defying every rule about unauthorized gatherings and after-school supervision. Sarah estimated at least 40 teenagers had somehow made their way into the basement, their faces glowing with the excitement of witnessing something forbidden and potentially life-changing. They arranged themselves around the perimeter of the wrestling area, creating an impromptu arena that hummed with nervous energy. Well, Brandon said, his voice carrying across the room with theatrical confidence. Hurricane Patterson actually showed up. I half expected you to chicken out and call in sick today. Sarah stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. The nickname caught her off guard. Someone had obviously done their research, digging up her old wrestling persona from college newspaper archives. But instead of feeling exposed, She felt a surge of pride. Hurricane Patterson had been someone to be reckoned with, and perhaps it was time for her to remember that. "I don't make promises I can't keep, Brandon," she replied, stepping onto the main wrestling mat with the fluid grace of someone returning to familiar territory. "The question is whether you're ready to back up all that tough talk with actual action." The crowd fell silent as the two opponents faced each other in the center of the mat. The contrast was striking. Brandon's obvious physical advantages in height and weight versus Sarah's compact, athletic build and predatory stillness. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like a mismatch. But Sarah could see what the students couldn't: the slight tremor in Brandon's hands, the way his eyes darted toward his friends for reassurance, the subtle shift in his posture that revealed his underlying uncertainty. "You sure about this, Teach?" Brandon asked, rolling his shoulders in what was meant to look like casual preparation, but came across as nervous energy. "I play varsity football. I work out every day. I don't want to hurt you." Sarah smiled, and for the first time since arriving at Lincoln Valley, it was predatory. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Mitchell, but I think you'll find I'm harder to hurt than you imagine." The match began without ceremony. Just two opponents circling each other like predators sizing up their prey. Brandon moved with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to using his size and strength to intimidate others. He lunged forward, attempting to use his weight advantage to overwhelm Sarah through brute force. It was exactly what she'd been expecting. Sarah sidestepped with fluid precision, using Brandon's momentum against him as she grabbed his extended arm and executed a perfect arm drag. Brandon stumbled forward, off balance and suddenly vulnerable, while Sarah moved behind him with the speed that had once earned her the Hurricane nickname. The basement erupted in gasps and excited shouts as Sarah wrapped her arms around Brandon's waist, her technique honed by years of facing opponents who thought they could overpower her through size alone. Brandon tried to plant his feet and resist, but Sarah had already committed to the takedown, driving forward with her legs while pulling back with her arms in a motion as natural as breathing. Brandon hit the mat hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs and wiping the confident smirk from his face. Sarah maintained control, transitioning smoothly into a pinning combination that left Brandon flat on his back, staring up at the fluorescent lights with the dawning realization that he'd severely underestimated his opponent. 2 points takedown, Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "Would you like to continue, or should we call this a learning experience?" Brandon's face flushed red with embarrassment and rage. He'd never been dominated so completely, especially not in front of his peers. The carefully constructed image of invincibility that had taken years to build was crumbling with each passing second. He scrambled to his feet, his movements now lacking the casual confidence he'd displayed moments earlier. "Lucky shot," he muttered, circling warily as he tried to regain some measure of composure. "Won't happen again." But it did happen again. And again. Each time Brandon attempted to use his strength to overpower Sarah, she used his aggression against him with surgical precision. A hip toss when he charged too aggressively. A single leg takedown when he tried to grab her around the waist. A perfectly timed sprawl when he shot for her legs in desperation. With each successive takedown, Brandon's movements became more frantic and less controlled. The crowd's initial excitement had shifted to something approaching awe as they witnessed a master class in technical wrestling. Even Derek and Austin had stopped recording, too mesmerized by the systematic dismantling of their leader's reputation to remember their phones. The final sequence came when Brandon, exhausted and humiliated, made one last desperate attempt to salvage his dignity. He charged forward with reckless abandon, hoping to use his remaining strength to overwhelm Sarah through sheer force of will. Instead, Sarah stepped aside and caught him in a perfect fireman's carry, lifting his full weight and driving him to the mat with authority that left no doubt about the outcome. Brandon lay on his back, chest heaving, sweat streaming down his face as he stared up at Sarah with something approaching respect. The cocky teenager who had entered the basement 30 minutes earlier was gone, replaced by a young man who had just learned that the world contained forces he couldn't bully or intimidate into submission. Sarah extended her hand to help him up, and this time Brandon took it without hesitation. As he struggled to his feet, she leaned close enough that only he could hear her words. "This isn't about humiliating you, Brandon," she said quietly. "It's about showing you that actions have consequences. Real ones. The question now is what you're going to do with this lesson." The crowd began to disperse in hushed whispers, already composing the text messages and social media posts that would immortalize this moment in Lincoln Valley High School legend. But Sarah barely noticed them leaving. Her attention was focused entirely on the young man standing before her, seeing perhaps for the first time, not the arrogant bully who had made her life miserable, but a confused teenager who had just had his entire worldview challenged. "Tomorrow," she said as she gathered her things, "we start fresh. No grudges, no revenge, just the opportunity to learn something new. Think you can handle that?" Brandon nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, ma'am." As Sarah climbed the stairs leading out of the basement, she could feel the weight of what she'd accomplished settling over her like a comfortable blanket. She'd done more than win a wrestling match. She'd reclaimed her classroom, her authority, and most importantly, her sense of self. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since arriving at Lincoln Valley High, she felt ready to face them. The morning after the wrestling match dawned gray and cold, with mountain clouds hanging low over Lincoln Valley like a heavy blanket. Sarah arrived at school expecting chaos, angry parents, administrative meetings, possibly even her termination. What she found instead was something far more unsettling: absolute silence. The hallways that had buzzed with excitement the previous afternoon now felt eerily subdued. Students moved through their routines with unusual quiet, shooting furtive glances in Sarah's direction but avoiding direct eye contact. It was as if the entire school was holding its breath, waiting to see what consequences would emerge from the unprecedented events in the basement. Principal Morrison's office door remained conspicuously closed throughout the morning, and Sarah found herself checking her email compulsively for the inevitable summons. She'd prepared her resignation letter the night before, accepting that her unconventional approach to classroom management had probably ended her teaching career before it truly began. But as the hours passed without official reaction, a different kind of anxiety began to take hold. Fourth period AP English arrived with an atmosphere unlike anything Sarah had experienced at Lincoln Valley. Brandon entered the classroom alone. Derek and Austin were notably absent, their usual formation broken for the first time since the semester began. He took a seat in the middle of the room rather than his customary back corner throne, his movements careful and deliberate as if he were navigating unfamiliar territory. The other students filed in with barely concealed fascination, their eyes darting between Sarah and Brandon as they tried to gauge the new dynamic. The power structure that had governed room 314 for months had been completely upended, leaving everyone uncertain about where they stood in the emerging order. Sarah began class with a discussion of character motivation in Macbeth, but she could feel the undercurrent of tension that made normal instruction nearly impossible. Every word carried additional weight. Every gesture was analyzed for hidden meaning. She was teaching to an audience that was more interested in real-life drama than Shakespearean tragedy. 20 minutes into the lesson, Brandon raised his hand. It was the first time he'd voluntarily participated in class discussion since Sarah's arrival, and the simple gesture sent ripples of surprise through the room. "Miss Patterson," he said, his voice lacking its usual edge of mockery, "when Macbeth realizes he's lost everything, why doesn't he just give up? Why keep fighting when he knows he can't win?" The question hung in the air with unexpected depth. Sarah studied Brandon's face, seeing something in his expression that hadn't been there before: genuine curiosity mixed with what might have been vulnerability. The cocky teenager who had terrorized previous teachers was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to be genuinely grappling with complex ideas. "What do you think, Brandon?" Sarah asked, turning the question back to him in a way that invited real discussion rather than performative defiance. Brandon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the open textbook before him. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "Maybe he's not fighting to win anymore," Brandon said slowly. "Maybe he's fighting because it's the only thing he knows how to do. Like when everything else falls apart, at least you can control whether you go down swinging or just ... give up." The insight was remarkable, not just for its literary sophistication, but for the personal truth that seemed to underlie it. Sarah felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected: respect for this young man who had made her life miserable, but was now revealing depth she hadn't suspected existed. The class continued with unprecedented engagement. Other students, emboldened by Brandon's participation, began offering their own interpretations and insights. For the first time since arriving at Lincoln Valley, Sarah felt like she was actually teaching rather than just trying to maintain order. After the bell rang and the other students filed out, Brandon lingered behind. He approached Sarah's desk with the hesitant movements of someone venturing into uncharted territory, his usual swagger replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "Miss Patterson," he began, then stopped, seemingly struggling with how to continue. "I wanted to. About yesterday, ... "You don't need to apologize, Brandon," Sarah said gently. "What happened in that basement stays in that basement. What matters is what we do moving forward." Brandon shook his head, his jaw tightening with determination. "No, I do need to say this. What I did with your laptop, the way I've been acting it, wasn't right, and it wasn't really about you." Sarah set down her pen and gave him her full attention. Something in his tone suggested this conversation was heading somewhere significant, and her instincts told her to let him find his own way. "There. My dad," Brandon continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "he's not exactly what people think he is. Everyone sees the successful businessman, the guy who sits on the school board and writes big checks to the athletic department. But at home..." He trailed off, staring out the window at the mountains beyond. Sarah waited, recognizing the signs of someone wrestling with whether to trust an adult with dangerous truths. "He expects me to be perfect," Brandon finally said. "Perfect grades, perfect athletic performance, perfect reputation. And when I'm not perfect, when I screw up even a little bit..." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a series of small circular scars on his forearm that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Brandon," she said softly, her teacher training kicking in as she recognized the signs she'd been taught to watch for, but hoped she'd never have to address. "Cigarette burns," he said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "Dad's favorite way of teaching me about consequences. Says it builds character, makes me tougher. The funny thing is, he's right, I am tough, just not in the way he intended." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Suddenly, Brandon's behavior made terrible sense: the need to project strength, the calculated cruelty toward anyone who seemed vulnerable, the desperate attempt to maintain control in the only environment where he had any power. He wasn't just a privileged teenager acting out. He was a victim trying to survive by becoming what he feared most. "How long has this been going on?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully controlled despite the rage building in her chest. "Since I was maybe 10, Brandon said with a shrug that tried to convey indifference but failed completely. "Started when my grades slipped in 4th grade. Dad said weakness was contagious, that if I didn't learn to be strong, I'd end up like my mom. Where is your mother, Brandon? His laugh was bitter and hollow. Psychiatric facility in Denver. Dad had her committed 3 years ago when she tried to leave him. Says she had a nervous breakdown, but I know better. She tried to protect me, and he made sure she'd never be able to do it again. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she processed this information. The Brandon Mitchell she'd been fighting wasn't the real enemy. He was another casualty in a war being waged by someone with far more power and far fewer scruples. Brandon, you know this isn't normal, right? What your father is doing, it's abuse. There are people who can help, resources available. With what evidence? Brandon interrupted, his voice hardening. You think anyone in this town is going to take my word against Thomas Mitchell? He owns half the businesses here, employs a quarter of the population. Even if someone believed me, where would that leave me? Foster care? Juvenile detention? At least now I know what to expect. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the classroom door. Derek and Austin entered without waiting for permission, their faces grim and purposeful. Sarah noticed immediately that Derek was sporting a fresh black eye, while Austin moved with the careful stiffness of someone trying to hide injured ribs. We need to talk, Derek said, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by something that looked like desperation. All of us. About what happened yesterday, and about what's going to happen next. Brandon's face went pale as he looked at his friend's injuries. He got to you, he said quietly. I told you to stay away from school today, to let this blow over. Your dad didn't give us much choice, Austin said, speaking for the first time. In Sarah's presence. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, but it carried an undertone of fear that made her skin crawl. He wants to see you at his office after school. Says there are going to be some changes in how you handle yourself around here. Sarah watched the blood drain from Brandon's face as the implications sank in. She was beginning to understand that yesterday's wrestling match had consequences far beyond the school walls, and that her victory might have put Brandon in terrible danger. What kind of changes? Brandon asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Derek and Austin exchanged a look before Derek answered. The kind that involves making sure yesterday never happens again, by any means necessary. The threat hung in the air like poison gas, and Sarah realized that her battle with Brandon had been nothing more than a skirmish in a much larger war. She'd won a classroom confrontation, but in doing so, she might have triggered something far more dangerous than teenage rebellion. Looking at the 3 boys, standing before her, one terrified, 2 already bearing the physical evidence of adult retaliation, Sarah understood that her real fight was just beginning. And this time, the stakes were far higher than her teaching career or classroom authority. This time, someone's life might be hanging in the balance. The hours following Derek and Austin's ominous warning stretched like an eternity for Sarah. She went through the motions of teaching her remaining classes, but her mind was consumed with the horrifying revelations about Brandon's home life and the escalating danger he now faced. Every time she looked at the clock, she imagined what might be happening at Thomas Mitchell's downtown office, and the scenarios that played out in her head became progressively more disturbing. By the time the final bell rang, Sarah had made her decision. She couldn't stand by and let an 18-year-old face whatever retribution his father had planned, especially knowing that her actions had triggered this crisis. The wrestling match that had felt like such a victory 24 hours earlier now seemed like a terrible mistake that had put an already vulnerable young man in even greater peril. Sarah drove through downtown Lincoln Valley with growing urgency, passing the pristine storefronts and carefully manicured parks that masked the town's darker secrets. Mitchell Construction and Development occupied a gleaming glass building on Main Street, its imposing facade designed to project wealth and power. As she pulled into the parking lot, Sarah noticed Brandon's battered Honda Civic sitting alone. Near the back, looking fragile and exposed beside the luxury vehicles that filled the executive spaces, dot through the building's floor-to-ceiling windows. Sarah could see into Thomas Mitchell's corner office on the second floor. Even from the parking lot, the man's physical presence was intimidating. Well over 6 feet tall, with the kind of broad shoulders and thick neck that suggested he'd maintained his high school football physique well into middle age. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his expensive suit impeccably tailored, and his commanding posture radiated the confidence of someone accustomed to absolute control. Brandon sat across from his father's massive oak desk, his body language telling a story of complete defeat. His shoulders were hunched, his head bowed, and even from a distance, Sarah could see the tremor in his hands that spoke of barely controlled terror. Whatever conversation was taking place in that office, it was clear that Brandon was on the losing end. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Help me, please. Can't take much more." The message galvanized her into action. Sarah had spent years studying child psychology and recognizing signs of abuse, but she'd never been faced with a situation that demanded immediate intervention. Every instinct told her to call the police or social services, but Brandon's earlier words echoed in her mind. "You think anyone in this town is going to take my word against Thomas Mitchell?" Instead, Sarah found herself walking through the building's marble lobby with the determined stride of someone who had made peace with the consequences of her actions. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with carefully styled blonde hair and nervous eyes, looked up with surprise as Sarah approached the desk. "I'm here to see Mr. Mitchell," Sarah announced with more confidence than she felt. "I'm Brandon's teacher, and we have an urgent matter to discuss regarding his academic progress." The receptionist's expression shifted to one of obvious discomfort. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Mitchell is in a private meeting with his son. Perhaps you could schedule an appointment for..." "This can't wait," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned to project in her most challenging classrooms. "Brandon's academic standing is in jeopardy, and as his father sits on the school board, I'm sure Mr. Mitchell would want to address this immediately." Before the receptionist could respond, Sarah was already walking toward the elevator, ignoring the woman's protests and the security guard who was rising from his chair near the entrance. She stabbed the button for the second floor with more force than necessary, her heart pounding as she committed to a course of action that could end her career and potentially make the situation worse for Brandon. The elevator doors opened to reveal a hallway lined with photographs of Thomas Mitchell's various business achievements and civic contributions. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah as she passed images of the man cutting ribbons at charity events and posing with local politicians, all while knowing what kind of monster lurked behind that carefully crafted public image. The sounds coming from Mitchell's office grew clearer as Sarah approached, not quite shouting, but the kind of low, menacing tone that was somehow more frightening than outright rage. She could hear Brandon's voice, barely audible, pleading with his father in words that made her blood boil. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to embarrass you. It won't happen again, I swear. Please, just let me explain." "Explain what?" "Thomas." Mitchell's voice was like ice wrapped in steel. "How do you let some little girl teacher humiliate you in front of half the school? How did you make our family look weak in front of people who already question whether you're worth the investment I've made in you?" Sarah didn't knock. She turned the handle and walked into the office with the same confidence she'd used to enter the building, knowing that hesitation would give Thomas Mitchell time to regain control of the narrative. What she saw inside made her stomach lurch. With rage and horror, Brandon was pressed against the wall beside his father's desk, his left arm twisted behind his back in a hold that was clearly causing significant pain. Thomas Mitchell loomed over his son, his free hand holding what appeared to be a lit cigarette just inches from Brandon's face. The acrid smell of tobacco mixed with something else, the unmistakable scent of burned flesh that suggested this wasn't the first time this particular punishment had been administered. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "I think we need to talk." Thomas Mitchell released his son so quickly that Brandon stumbled and nearly fell, catching himself against the desk with a gasp of relief and pain. The older man turned to face Sarah with the fluid grace of a predator, his blue eyes so similar to Brandon's, now cold and calculating as he assessed this unexpected threat to his authority. "Miss Patterson, isn't it?" he said, his voice shifting effortlessly from menacing to charming. "I've heard quite a lot about you from my son and his friends. Please, come in. Brandon and I were just having a discussion about appropriate behavior and consequences." "I can see that," Sarah replied, making no effort to hide her disgust as she looked at the cigarette still smoldering in Mitchell's hand. "Brandon, are you all right?" The teenager nodded quickly, but Sarah could see the fresh burn mark on his neck, barely concealed by his collar. The sight of it filled her with a rage so pure and focused that she had to consciously prevent herself from doing something that would only make the situation worse. "Mr. Mitchell," she continued, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about what happened at school yesterday. Brandon wasn't the instigator of that incident. If anything, he was trying to prevent a much worse situation from developing." Thomas Mitchell's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "How thoughtful of you to defend my son, Miss Patterson. But I'm afraid you don't understand the full context of the situation. Brandon has been struggling with authority issues for some time now, and yesterday's performance was simply the latest in a pattern of behavior that requires firm correction." "The only thing that requires correction," Sarah said, taking a step closer, "is a grown man who thinks terrorizing children makes him strong." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Thomas Mitchell's mask of civility finally slipped. His eyes narrowed to slits, and when he spoke, his voice carried the promise of violence that Brandon had lived with for years. "I think you should leave now, Miss Patterson, before you say something that gets you into more trouble than you can handle." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Mitchell?" Sarah asked, pulling out her phone with deliberate slowness. "Because I should mention that I've been recording this conversation since I walked into the room, including the part where you had a lit cigarette pressed against your son's skin." It was a bluff. Her phone had been in her pocket the entire time, but the effect was immediate and dramatic. Thomas Mitchell's face went white, then red, then white again as he processed the implications of what Sarah had claimed. The cigarette fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers, landing on the expensive carpet with a soft hiss. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, his voice barely controlled. "I own this town. I employ half the people in it. I can destroy your career with a single phone call." "Maybe," Sarah acknowledged, "but you can't unring the bell. Once this recording gets to the right people, the state police, for instance, or the media outlets in Denver, who would love to run a story about a prominent businessman who abuses his own son." Brandon watched this exchange with growing amazement, as if he couldn't quite believe that someone was actually standing up to his father. Years of conditioning had taught him that Thomas Mitchell was invincible, that his power was absolute within the boundaries of Lincoln Valley. To see him backing down, even slightly, was like witnessing a fundamental law of physics being overturned. "What do you want?" Thomas Mitchell asked finally, his voice heavy with defeat and barely suppressed rage. "I want Brandon to come with me," Sarah said simply. "Right now, no arguments, no conditions, no threats of retaliation. And I want your word that you won't try to contact him or intimidate him into coming back. He's my son." "You can't just—" "He's 18 years old," Sarah interrupted. "Legally an adult who can make his own decisions about where he lives and how he spends his time. The only question is whether he leaves here voluntarily with me, or whether I make that phone call to the authorities and let them sort out the custody arrangements." Thomas Mitchell looked at his son for a long moment, and Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes as he weighed his options. Finally, he spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "If you walk out that door with her, you're no longer my son. No more money, no more protection, no more family name. You'll be on your own in a world that doesn't give a damn about weak little boys who can't handle a little discipline." Brandon straightened slowly, and for the first time since Sarah had known him, she saw the real person beneath the defensive armor he'd constructed. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. "I stopped being your son the first time you burned me with a cigarette. Dad, I just didn't have the courage to admit it until now." The walk from Thomas Mitchell's office to the parking lot felt like the longest journey of Sarah's life. She kept expecting security guards to appear, or police officers loyal to the Mitchell family, or some other obstacle that would prevent their escape. But they made it to her car without incident, Brandon climbing into the passenger seat with the careful movements of someone still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. As they drove away from the Mitchell construction building, Sarah caught glimpses of Brandon in her peripheral vision. He was staring out the window at the town he'd grown up in, but she suspected he was really seeing it for the first time, not as the kingdom where his father reigned supreme, but as a place he might finally be free to leave behind. "Where are we going?" he asked quietly. "Somewhere safe," Sarah replied, "and then we're going to figure out what comes next." The drive to Sarah's apartment complex took them through the winding mountain roads that surrounded Lincoln Valley, past forests of aspen and pine that were just beginning to show their autumn colors. It was a beautiful country, the kind of place that appeared on postcards and tourism brochures, but Sarah knew that natural beauty could mask human ugliness, just as easily as urban decay could hide unexpected kindness. Her apartment was modest, but comfortable, a one-bedroom unit with a view of the valley that she'd fallen in love with the moment she'd seen it. Brandon stood in her living room, looking lost and overwhelmed, as if he couldn't quite process the fact that he was in a space where no one was going to hurt him. "Are you hungry?" Sarah asked, falling back on the practical concerns that helped ground her when emotions threatened to become overwhelming. Brandon shook his head, then changed his mind and nodded. "I haven't eaten since breakfast. Dad doesn't allow food during discussions." Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, giving Brandon time to process his new circumstances while she prepared a simple meal. As she worked, she found herself thinking about the phone call she would need to make to social services, to the police, to Principal Morrison. The bureaucratic machinery of protection and intervention would need to be set in motion, but for now, her priority was simply ensuring that Brandon felt safe. When she returned to the living room with sandwiches and hot coffee, she found Brandon examining the framed photographs on her bookshelf, images from her wrestling days, her college graduation, her first teaching position. He picked up a picture of her receiving a championship medal, studying it with the intensity of someone trying to understand how the confident young woman in the photo had become the teacher who just rescued him from hell. "You really were good at this," he said, holding up the photograph. "I mean, I knew you could wrestle when you beat me yesterday, but I didn't realize you were actually good." Sarah smiled, settling into the chair across from her couch, where Brandon had taken a seat. "I had my moments. Wrestling taught me a lot about standing up to people who thought they were stronger than me." "Is that why you became a teacher, to help kids like me?" The question caught Sarah off guard with its directness and perceptiveness. She'd told herself that she became a teacher to make a difference, to inspire young minds, to give back to her community. But sitting here with this young man who'd been failed by every adult in his life, she realized that her motivations were more personal than she'd admitted. "Maybe," she said honestly, "I think I became a teacher because I remember what it felt like to feel powerless, and I wanted to make sure other kids knew they had someone in their corner." Brandon nodded slowly, understanding passing between them that didn't require words. They ate in comfortable silence, both processing the events of the day and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Outside the window, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too beautiful for the day they'd both endured. "What happens now?" Brandon asked finally. "Now we make sure you're safe," Sarah replied. "We get you connected with people who can help, make sure you have somewhere to live, help you finish high school, and figure out what comes after that. And what about school? Tomorrow, I mean. Everyone's going to know something happened." Sarah considered this. The rumor mill at Lincoln Valley High would be working overtime to explain Brandon's absence from his father's office building, especially if there had been witnesses to their dramatic exit. The story would be embellished and distorted with each telling, but the basic truth would remain. The teacher and student who'd faced off in the wrestling room had somehow become allies against a common enemy. "Tomorrow we will take it one step at a time," she said. "You don't have to go back to being the person you were before. You get to decide who you want to be now." Brandon was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening valley below. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of wonder that suggested he was only beginning to comprehend possibilities that lay before him. "I don't even know who that is," he admitted. "I've been angry for so long, I forgot there might be other ways to be strong." "There are," Sarah assured him, "and we're going to figure them out together." As night settled over Lincoln Valley, Sarah and Brandon began the long process of planning a future that neither of them could have imagined 24 hours earlier. The wrestling match that had started as a battle for classroom authority had become something much more significant, the first step in a young man's journey from victim to survivor, and a teacher's evolution from instructor to protector. The real fight, Sarah realized, hadn't been in the basement wrestling room at all. It had been in Thomas Mitchell's office, where a vulnerable teenager had finally found the courage to choose freedom over familiar pain. And while the road ahead would be challenging, Sarah was confident that Brandon Mitchell, the real Brandon, not the angry facade he'd constructed to survive, was strong enough to walk it. 3 months after the rescue from Thomas Mitchell's office, Lincoln Valley High School bore little resemblance to the battlefield Sarah had first encountered. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Real change never does, but the ripple effects of that October evening had spread through the school community like wildfire, touching lives in ways no one could have predicted. The initial aftermath had been turbulent. Thomas Mitchell's attempts to discredit Sarah and force Brandon's return had dominated local news for weeks, splitting the community between those who refused to believe their golden boy businessman could be capable of abuse, and others who had long suspected that something dark lurked beneath the Mitchell family's pristine facade. The investigation that followed, triggered by Sarah's detailed report to state authorities, had uncovered evidence that went far beyond the cigarette burns and psychological torment Brandon had endured. Detective Maria Santos, a seasoned investigator from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, had found financial irregularities in Mitchell construction that suggested years of embezzlement and fraud. More disturbing were the medical records from the private psychiatric facility where Brandon's mother was being held, records that painted a picture of a woman who had been systematically drugged and isolated to prevent her from exposing her husband's crimes. The case had exploded into a statewide scandal that reached far beyond the borders of Lincoln Valley. Brandon himself had become an unexpected symbol of resilience and courage. The scared, angry teenager who had once terrorized teachers and students alike had transformed into a thoughtful young man who used his experience to help other abuse victims find their voices. He'd testified before the state legislature about the failures of the child protection system, spoken at conferences for educators about recognizing signs of domestic abuse, and become a peer counselor for students dealing with family trauma. Change in his academic performance had been nothing short of remarkable. Free from the constant stress of his home environment, Brandon's natural intelligence had flourished. He'd discovered a passion for creative writing, channeling his experiences into powerful essays and stories that had earned him recognition in several statewide competitions. His teachers, particularly Sarah, watched with amazement as he developed. From a student who disrupted classes to one who elevated them through his insights and participation. The thing about being afraid all the time, Brandon had written in an essay that won first place in Colorado's Young Voices competition, is that it doesn't just make you scared. It makes you angry because being angry feels stronger than being helpless. But real strength isn't about making other people afraid of you. It's about making them feel safe enough to be vulnerable around you. The essay had been read aloud at a school assembly, and Sarah had watched from the back of the auditorium as Brandon, now serving as student council president, delivered his words with quiet conviction. The same voice that had once dripped with mockery and cruelty now carried hope and healing, reaching students who had given up on the possibility that adults could be trusted, or that their own circumstances could improve. Derek Chun and Austin Rodriguez had undergone their own transformations, though their journeys had been more complicated. Derek's revelation that his own family life involved pressures and expectations that bordered on abuse had led to family counseling and a gradual rebuilding of relationships. His technological skills, once used for cyberbullying and harassment, had been redirected toward creating apps and websites that help students connect with mental health resources and support groups. Austin's path had been perhaps the most challenging. The silent giant who had been intimidated through his mere presence had struggled to find his voice and identity without the structure that Brandon's leadership had provided. It was Sarah who had suggested he try joining the school's theater program, recognizing that his imposing physical presence could be an asset on stage rather than a weapon in the hallways. His portrayal of Lenny in the fall production of Mice and Men had revealed depths of sensitivity and emotional intelligence that had surprised everyone, including himself. "I never thought about how scary I looked to other people," Austin had confided to Sarah after one of their regular check-in sessions. "When you're big like me, people expect you to be the tough guy, the enforcer. But I was just trying to fit in somewhere, you know? I didn't know there were other ways to belong." The three former bullies had become something unprecedented at Lincoln Valley High, a support network that actively worked to prevent the kind of toxic dynamics they had once perpetuated. They'd established a peer mediation program that addressed conflicts before they escalated, created safe spaces for students dealing with family problems, and worked with the administration to implement policies that protected vulnerable students from harassment and abuse. Sarah's role in these transformations had been complex and sometimes controversial. Her unconventional methods, particularly the basement wrestling match, had drawn criticism from some educational professionals who argued that physical confrontation had no place in classroom management. But the results spoke for themselves. Not only had Brandon's behavior completely changed, but the entire culture of the school had shifted toward greater empathy and mutual support. Principal Morrison, initially skeptical of Sarah's approach, had become one of her strongest advocates after witnessing the dramatic improvement in school climate. Disciplinary incidents had dropped by 60%, academic achievement scores had increased across all grade levels, and teacher retention, historically a major problem at Lincoln Valley, had improved dramatically as the hostile environment that had driven away previous educators gradually disappeared. Sarah Patterson didn't just save one student, Principal Morrison had written in her annual report to the school board. She saved our entire school community by showing us that real education isn't about maintaining order through fear. It's about creating environments where young people feel safe enough to grow and change. The laptop that had started it all destroyed in that water incident that seemed like a lifetime ago had been replaced with a top-of-the-line system donated by a technology company that had heard Brandon's story. But more importantly, Sarah had learned that her most effective teaching tools weren't digital presentations or multimedia resources. They were empathy, courage, and the willingness to see potential in students that others had written off as lost causes. The legal proceedings against Thomas Mitchell had concluded with convictions on multiple charges including child abuse, fraud, and unlawful imprisonment. He'd been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, his business empire dismantled, and his assets liquidated to provide restitution to his victims. Brandon's mother, Elizabeth, had been released from the psychiatric facility and was slowly rebuilding her relationship with her son while receiving treatment for the trauma she'd endured. For years, I felt like I'd failed him, Elizabeth had told Sarah during one of their meetings at the small apartment, where she was learning to live independently again. I was supposed to protect my child, and instead I let his father destroy both of us. But watching Brandon now, seeing the man he's becoming, I think maybe I did give him something after all. I gave him the knowledge that love doesn't have to hurt. The community itself had undergone a reckoning that extended far beyond the Mitchell family scandal. Other cases of abuse and neglect had come to light as victims found the courage to speak out. Inspired by Brandon's example, social services had implemented new protocols for investigating prominent families, and the untouchable status that wealth and influence had once provided had been permanently shattered. Local businesses had stepped up to support programs for at-risk youth, recognizing that their community's prosperity meant nothing if its children weren't safe and supported. The Lincoln Valley Youth Center, funded by donations from residents horrified by what had been happening in their midst, provided counseling, educational support, and safe spaces for teenagers dealing with family dysfunction. Sarah's classroom had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for educators from across the state who wanted to understand how she'd managed to transform such a challenging environment. She'd been invited to speak at conferences, write articles for educational journals, and consult with schools dealing with similar problems. But her favorite moments were still the quiet ones, watching a shy student find their voice during class discussion, seeing former enemies work together on group projects, or receiving letters from graduates who credited her with helping them discover their potential. The spring semester brought new challenges and opportunities. Brandon had been accepted to several prestigious universities with full scholarships, his essay about overcoming adversity having resonated with admissions committees across the country. Derek had been recruited by tech companies impressed with his innovative apps for student mental health support. Austin had discovered a passion for social work and planned to pursue a degree that would allow him to help other young people navigate family trauma. The weird thing, Brandon had mused during one of their regular after-school conversations, is that I'm actually grateful for what my father put me through. Not because I deserved it or because it was okay, it wasn't. But because it taught me that I'm stronger than I ever imagined, and it showed me what kind of person I never want to become. Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Her own experiences with bullying and adversity had shaped her into someone who could recognize pain in others and respond with compassion rather than judgment. The wrestling skills that had helped her physically overpower Brandon had been less important than the emotional intelligence that had allowed her to see through his aggressive facade to the frightened child underneath. The year-end academic awards ceremony at Lincoln Valley High took place on a warm May evening, with families gathering in the gymnasium that had once felt like hostile territory. Sarah sat with the other faculty members, watching as Brandon delivered the valedictorian address to a crowd that included students, parents, and community members who had been touched by his story. A year ago, Brandon began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed gymnasium, I was a very different person than I am today. I was angry, afraid, and I hurt people because I thought that making others feel small would somehow make me feel bigger. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I was especially wrong about what it means to be strong. He paused, his eyes finding Sarah in the crowd. Real strength isn't about intimidating others or proving that you can't be hurt. Real strength is about being vulnerable enough to admit when you're wrong, brave enough to ask for help when you need it, and generous enough to offer support to others who are struggling with their own battles. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Sarah barely heard it. She was thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this moment, from that first confrontation in room 314, to the wrestling match in the basement, to the rescue. From Thomas Mitchell's office to this celebration of transformation and growth. As the ceremony concluded and families began to mingle and take photographs, Brandon approached Sarah with the easy confidence of someone who had finally learned to be comfortable in his own skin. He'd grown several inches over the course of the year, but more importantly, he carried himself with a dignity and purpose that spoke of genuine maturity rather than manufactured bravado. "I wanted to thank you," he said simply. "Not just for getting me away from my father, though that was huge, but for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself, for believing that I could be better than what I was." Sarah felt tears threatening as she looked at this remarkable young man who had emerged from the ashes of his former self. "You did all the hard work, Brandon. I just provided a safe space for you to grow." "No," he said firmly. "You did more than that. You showed me that adults could be trusted, that strength could be gentle, and that it was possible to start over no matter how badly you'd screwed up before. You saved my life in ways you'll probably never fully understand." The conversation was interrupted by Derek and Austin, who approached with the easy camaraderie of friends who had been through battles together and emerged stronger for the experience. They'd all grown and changed in the months since the laptop incident, but their bond had remained strong, no longer based on shared cruelty, but on mutual support and understanding. "Miss Patterson," Derek said with a grin, "we wanted to let you know that we're planning to come back and visit next year. Maybe speak to your new students about what it's really like to change when you think you can't." "That would be wonderful," Sarah replied, meaning every word. "I think you three have wisdom to share that could help a lot of young people." As the evening wound down and the gymnasium gradually emptied, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts in the classroom where it had all begun. Room 314 looked much the same as it had that first day in October, but the atmosphere was completely different. The tension and hostility had been replaced by an environment where learning could actually take place, where students felt safe enough to take intellectual risks and explore new ideas. Her laptop, the replacement one, sat closed on her desk, no longer the target of teenage aggression, but simply another tool in her educational arsenal. The real lesson plans she'd learned weren't stored on hard drives or written in notebooks. They were created fresh each day through the relationships she built with her students and the safe spaces she helped them create for growth and discovery. A knock on the door interrupted her reflection. Mrs. Brennan, the veteran math teacher who had offered crucial advice during those first difficult weeks, entered with her characteristic no-nonsense demeanor softened by genuine warmth. "Quite a transformation," Mrs. Brennan observed, settling into one of the student desks with the familiarity of someone who had spent decades in similar spaces. "I've been teaching for 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like what you've accomplished here." "It wasn't just me," Sarah protested. "Brandon and the others did the real work of changing themselves." "True," Mrs. Brennan acknowledged. "But they needed someone to show them it was possible. Someone who was willing to meet them where they were instead of where we thought they should be. Someone who understood that sometimes the most disruptive students are the ones who need the most support." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two educators reflecting on the mysterious alchemy that transforms classrooms from battlegrounds into sanctuaries. Sarah thought about the students she'd be teaching in the fall, a new group of teenagers carrying their own mix of hopes and fears, strengths and vulnerabilities. "What's your secret?" Mrs. Brennan asked finally. "How do you reach kids that other teachers can't connect with?" Sarah considered the question carefully. It was one she'd been asked many times over the past few months by journalists, fellow educators, and administrators looking for a formula they could replicate in their own schools. "I don't think there's a secret," she said finally. "I think it's just about remembering that every difficult behavior has a reason behind it, and that our job isn't to punish kids for being damaged. It's to help them heal so they can become who they're meant to be." Mrs. Brennan nodded thoughtfully. "And the wrestling match? The physical confrontation that everyone's been talking about?" Sarah smiled ruefully. "That was probably the least important part of the whole process. Brandon didn't change because I could pin him to a mat. He changed because someone finally bothered to ask why he was acting out, instead of just trying to shut him down." "Still," Mrs. Brennan said with a wry grin, "it certainly got his attention." As they walked out of the school together, Sarah reflected on the year that had transformed not just her students, but herself as well. She'd arrived at Lincoln Valley High as an idealistic young teacher hoping to make a difference. She was leaving temporarily for the summer break as someone who had learned that making a difference sometimes required taking risks that went far beyond conventional teaching methods. The mountains surrounding Lincoln Valley were painted in the soft pastels of sunset, their peaks catching the last light of what had been a perfect spring day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new opportunities to build bridges between potential and achievement. But tonight, Sarah was content to savor the knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, one person's willingness to see beyond surface behavior to underlying pain could start a chain reaction of healing that transformed an entire community. The laptop incident that had started it all seemed like ancient history now, a catalyst that had set in motion changes that none of them could have predicted. Brandon Mitchell, once the most feared bully in the school, had become a symbol of hope and redemption. Sarah Patterson, the teacher who'd been pushed to her breaking point, had discovered reservoirs of courage and creativity she'd never known she possessed. And in room 314, where the battle for one young man's soul had been won through patient persistence and unwavering belief in the possibility of change, future students would benefit from the hard-won wisdom that sometimes the most disruptive behaviors are really just cries for help from young people who have forgotten that they deserve to be loved. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.